it's a great pleasure for me to be able to give this presentation to you, and I'm most grateful to the KidneyX people for awarding me a grant to follow up with this work that I'm going to outline very briefly to you now. So, what I'm going to talk about is the pig as a source of kidneys for clinical transplantation. You probably all saw reports in the paper just over a year ago of my colleague surgeon Bartley Griffith, who carried out a pig heart transplant in this patient of his at the University of Maryland. The heart worked very well for about 6 weeks, and then problems developed, and sadly the patient died after about 2 months. But it did give us some encouragement that pig organs will work very well in patients, and this supports all of the data that we've accrued over many years of the results of pig hearts and kidneys functioning in non-human primates. So this is encouraging. Now, this is a slide which some of you I'm sure have seen before. This is in blue is the number of deceased human donors who become available each year. And you can see it is slowly going up. But in red is the number of organ transplants that are carried out using organs from those donors. And that's also going up. But in black is the number of patients added to the waiting list each year. And you can see that's going up even quicker. The actual total is actually now about over 100,000, but this shows just the increase over the last few years. So we're losing the battle here. The more patients are being put on the list than we're able to provide a donor organ for. So the problem is an inadequate number of organs for transplantation. And we suggest that the solution is the transplantation of organs from genetically engineered or gene-edited pigs, a topic we call xenotransplantation. Now, if you put a wild-type pig kidney, that by wild type I mean an ordinary domesticated sow or a boar, if you put a kidney from them into an immunosuppressed non-human primate such as a baboon, as soon as you release the operative clamps, the kidney becomes well perfused with red blood. As you can see here, it looks very healthy. But within minutes, it can look like this, completely destroyed. This is literally 5 minutes after we put it in. And this is from some years ago now. And you can see that it's black, mainly because the blood vessels have all thrombosed. They've then been disrupted, and there's been bleeding into the tissues of both the kidney and the ureter that carries the urine from the kidney down to the bladder. So it's a very, very dramatic and vigorous immune response. So why have we got such a bad response? Why do we reject this organ so quickly? Well, Klaus Hammer, the late Klaus Hammer, who was both a surgeon and a veterinary surgeon, he pointed out that the evolutionary distance between humans and pigs comprises 80 million years. That's how long we've been diverging from each other. And so what we're trying to do is to outwit evolution. We're trying to overcome that 80 million years of divergence in order to make the pig more acceptable and more like the human. And so it's a major undertaking, and that's why it's taken us so long. And this is how I've certainly felt. I'm the little guy on the right, holding back this vigorous immune response, this rejection response, for the last 20 or 30 years. And slowly we've begun to overcome that immune response. But that's how it's felt like to those of us in this field of research. And I like this quote. It's a little like wrestling a gorilla, but you don't quit when you're tired. You quit when the gorilla is tired. And fortunately, it seems now that the gorilla, that is this vigorous immune response, is beginning to be tired, and we are beginning to overcome it. And so we're beginning to win the battle. Randall Morris is a friend of mine who used to be a cardiac surgeon and then went, like I did, into transplant immunology research. And many years ago, he was involved in this field of xenotransplantation. And he pointed out that there are 3 golden rules for achieving successful xenotransplantation. But then he added, Unfortunately, we don't know any of them. And at that time, that was quite correct. But fortunately, over the last 20 or 30 years, we do know many of those rules and we're beginning to overcome them. In fact, we're quite advanced in overcoming them. Um, and importantly, and this is probably the most important slide I will show you in this short presentation, this is the first time in transplantation that we're able to modify the donor of the organ rather than just treat the recipient. We've been treating the recipient by suppressing their immune response, their rejection response to the graft, but now we can modify the graft so that the rejection response is less vigorous. And I believe quite firmly that eventually we may be able to do enough to the donor pig kidney or pig heart that we no longer need to treat the recipient at all. Because the pig organ will protect itself from the human immune response. And that will be wonderful because many of the side effects of those drugs that we give to the patients to prevent rejection or suppress rejection have side effects which are detrimental to their quality of life. So, what is the solution to this problem? Well, first of all, we need pigs that have been genetically engineered or gene edited. And that is that they've been modified to protect themselves or protect their organs from the human immune response, from the human rejection response. So we can do quite a lot to the pig itself. But in addition, today, unfortunately, we still need to give some immunosuppressive therapy. And you can see here I've put novel immunosuppressive therapy because I'm referring to drugs that are not yet clinically available for patients with human organ transplants, but we know are much more effective than the drugs that are available for protecting and protecting the pig organs from rejection. And so we need better immunosuppressive therapy using these new drugs that are becoming available to us today. And I won't go into this, it's too detailed, but if you can see here on the left side here, we take a pig cell and we take the nucleus out and we manipulate the nucleus by putting in a gene or taking out a gene. And then we put that back into an empty pig cell. And from that, uh, the new pig is born. And so we've actually manipulated the pig at this very early stage of the top left here. And then it's when the piglet is born, it has the genetic manipulation that we put in at that initial step. And so that's very, very important. So we have pigs now that actually have up to 10 genetic manipulations, 10 genetic changes, all aimed to protect that pig kidney or heart from the human or non-human primate immune response. And some of those pig kidneys are now functioning in non-human primates for greater than a year. Unfortunately, the results are not yet consistent enough to warrant a clinical trial. The FDA in the United States would want us to get more consistent survival. If we could get 5 out of 6 surviving a year, that would probably be sufficient. Unfortunately, although we get several going over a year, we also get several that don't survive for more than a few months. And so we have to get a more consistent result before we can begin a clinical trial. Now, how can we do that? Well, one way is we can try to improve the immunosuppressive regimen that we're giving. And that is what this grant that I've been awarded we will be concentrating on. We are very close to getting the right immunosuppressive regimen, but we still need a few little manipulations in it or improvements in order to consistently get out for more than a year. And so, what does the immunosuppression consist of? Well, we need to deplete the cells in the recipient, whether that's a recipient of a non human primate or a human, that cause rejection. We know what cells they are, and we can give drugs that knock those cells out, largely at least. And then we need to inhibit the recovery of those cells. And we have drugs that will do that as well. And there's quite an inflammatory response after you put in a pig organ into a non-human primate, and we need to suppress the inflammatory response to that pig organ as well. And we have drugs that will do all of these things. And so this regimen is currently being tested in the pig to baboon kidney transplant model, and that is what we will continue to do under the auspices of this, with funding from this grant. Now, finally, if we can get this to work well and consistently in non-human primates, what patients would we offer an opportunity of participating in the first clinical trials of pig kidney transplantation? And I'm going to confine myself to the kidney at the moment. Well, there are patients who are on the waiting list for a human kidney donor organ, but they will likely never receive the deceased donor kidney allograft, an allograft being a human organ. They may be patients who are at the upper limit of ages, 55 to 65 or even older, but if they're in good physiological state, that doesn't preclude them having a transplant. We know that patients of blood group O or B spend longer in the waiting list. It's longer for them to get a deceased human organ, and so they would be more suitable for a xenotransplant. And patients who have diabetes with a diabetic cause of their kidney disease, they do less well when they're waiting on the waiting list than others. Some of them are more likely to die when they've been on the waiting list for more than 2 years than they are to get a graft. And so those patients would get some sort of priority, of course. And this gives you an example. If you look on the right, where it says wait list while on dialysis in red there, these are patients who were obviously good candidates for a kidney transplant when they were put on the waiting list. But you can see within 60 months or 5 years, about 45% of them have been taken off the waiting list, either because they sadly died or because they are no longer suitable candidates. They developed other problems, what we call comorbidities, that really will make the result of the transplant unsuccessful. And so they're no longer candidates for a transplant. And if you go, and many patients wait longer than 5 years. So if you go longer, of course, more and more patients will come off the waiting list, either because they die on the waiting list or because they're no longer candidates for transplant. And so those patients, who many of whom you can predict right from the word go that they're unlikely to get a human donor, for example, the patients in the age group I've mentioned, and with the blood types I've mentioned, and perhaps if they're diabetic, then we could predict early on, and we could say to them, you're unlikely to get a human donor organ. Would you like to consider a pig organ donor? And if that will support you even for a year or two, that would be a better quality of life than being on dialysis 3 times a week for a year or two. And so they're the patients that I think we would direct our attention to. Now, finally, I firmly believe that one day organ transplantation from deceased human donors will be of historic interest only. All the transplants will be from genetically engineered pig donors. And people will, in 30 or 40 years' time, they'll look back and they say, do you realize once upon a time they used to transplant organs from dead people into them? And they'll be surprised that we did this, because the results of the pig organ transplants will be so successful, and it will become the routine rather than the exception. So thank you very much for your attention.